Well, hey there team, and welcome back to the channel and welcome to my overview of Thronefall. So for those not across it, I do overviews on this channel, so I take a look at the first 2 hours of a game. That's the Steam refund window. Steam says you can make up your mind about whether you want to keep a game or not in that time, and broadly speaking as a rule I would agree and say 20 hours in, you're usually not going to change your mind about how you felt 2 hours in. So it's a short punchy video, broad strokes info, keep it around 10 minutes, and then you can make up your mind on your own. So Thronefall, it's gone 1.0. I actually looked at it off channel back in early access and put a few hours in. For whatever reason, a video never made it out, which is a bit tragic because it was pretty brilliant then and it's very brilliant now. I've put a few more hours into it now. I guess you could call it a review, but whatever, we'll stick with overview. But the long and short of it is, this is a compact little game, simple in execution, dare I say a perfect kind of palate cleanser, but it's just excellently done in all aspects. It's only going for like $20 Australian, so it's pretty cheap. And yeah, I would highly recommend it. Say it's worth your time and money. The magic of it is like I wouldn't even necessarily need to explain to you what it is. You can see it from the footage. It's very much similar to something like Kingdom, Two Crowns, that sort of stuff, except in a more, isometric, let's say 3D environment, as opposed to the sort of 2 to 2.5D side scrolling. Which is to say, this is essentially a hybrid of tower defense and colony, economic throughput, but it's all very, bite-sized, quite punchy. That said, a run can still go for like half an hour or something like that because it is escalating waves. I know I drew the comparison to something like Kingdom, but that's very much, I guess real time. This is very much stop-start, wave-based. Between waves, you will invest in your economy, your defenses, build it up, very tower defense-esque, and then you basically pull the trigger and then you take on the waves of enemies. And that's it. That's as complex as it gets. It's just clean. It's very graspable. So far, I've flown through probably half a dozen missions. There's like an overworld map and different biomes, and they all have their own kind of gimmick in the terrain in which they're set. And there's also like an escalation of the enemies it sends against you. Start getting into that territory of guys that only fly, and therefore, if you've got little melee foot troopers, they're not going to do a lot for that wave. But this is what I would call tower defense standard fare. Now, funnily enough, I don't actually really like tower defense that much. I'm a bit prickly when it comes to these sort of genres. We've covered quite a lot recently the more, how would you say, robust defense type games that are sort of aping on They Are Billions. We looked at Cataclysmo, and diplomacy is not an option. And within their paradigm, that one's simpler and one's more complex. So I guess if you like those, or rather, they're just a bit too thick, a bit too heavy, which I wouldn't blame you. That's probably my largest complaint with those sort of games. Not that I'm trying to bash on them or anything like that, but it is one of those things that you will invest hours and hours and potentially save scum and re-roll to try and build up, and ultimately, you'll face a final wave after X hours and lose to it because perhaps you didn't build your base or economy correctly half an hour ago and you didn't know. So this game is for you if those are kind of, nitpicks, let's say, that keep you away from this space, these sort of genres. But yeah, the comparisons to Kingdom, Two Crowns are very apt. You pretty much collect coin economy from, killing dudes, but also from passive buildings. And you pretty much, it's a 1 or 2 button type game. You reinvest it into blueprints. I've been using controller and thumbstick. It just works much better that way. But one of the really clever and inspired interface choices is that you can hold down, I think it's like left bumper or something like that, and it will bring up a kind of holographic overlay of potential blueprints. Now, as you level your town hall up, that in turn will extend more and more, and what starts out as a fairly humble little hamlet of, maybe you build some buildings or some wheat fields for some rudimentary economy and a couple of towers, maybe a little standing army. By the time you get up into tier 2, tier 3, you're building out much more robust infrastructure, walls that go bigger and higher in levels, same as your towers, and then they can specialize, bridges and research academies that as each day or wave ticks over, the research will progress. And similar to that, we've got a little bit more nuance in the economy now with fishing villages or ports or whatever you'd like to call them. So once you build them, they'll essentially every turn that goes past, they will spawn a new ship, and that will increase. So it's sort of a investment opportunity that you want to get in front of. Similar to, say, the research. Getting things like those on the table early will advantage you quite a bit in the late. And I mentioned before, like, houses are pretty much stock standard solid income, but they're not the most efficient. If you wanted to build, say, mills and fields, they get you a lot more yield, but they are relatively fragile and easier to destroy. All it really takes is one psycho swordsman in amongst your fields to kind of ruin half of your economy. But, you know, even things like embracing its more, let's say, pseudo-casual nature, when you do have half your fort blown down and your villages sacked and burnt to the ground, all they really do is they'll rebuild. And essentially, as I understand it, they're turned off for the next wave, right? So there is still a penalty for allowing buildings and structures to be destroyed, or at least economic ones. So you're incentivized to protect them and build them up because the income is on a per turn basis. So you really kind of want to ride that lightning of get as many of your fragile economic buildings up and as little military as possible, as it were, or at least that can hold it down without losing those buildings. So there's this boundary that you're ever incentivized to push to try and get in front of the economic game. However, that said, the standard difficulty for much of these challenges isn't super tasking. I think I failed once because I misunderstood a wave of, flyers going straight over everything. But that was less the difficulty curve stomping me and more overlooking something anecdotally. The longer term replayability, I suppose you could say, comes from like mutators. Each mission, once you complete it, will have like 1 of 6. Congratulations, you beat the thing. And then underneath it will have, well, beat it with not using this weapon, or using this weapon, or this combination of traits, or these mutators, things like they'll drop less gold, but they'll be stronger, right? Which is great because I've talked about this ad nauseum. I'm not a huge sandbox dude. I think if you just drop a player into an open world with no stakes and just do whatever you want, to me that's more like giving a painter an easel and a brush, but then trying to tell them that it's a designed game. Everyone's different, obviously, and there are people that are more artistic and creative, but the closer to the sandbox, the further from an objective-based experience you get, in my opinion. And that kind of applies to mutators. I have to really be in love with a game's loop to actually go in there and say, well, I want to increase the difficulty by 10% or change this or that. Most games, I'm stock standard, and I know this is a normie position, I know I'm not alone, but doing something like this, saying, well, if you want to play it again and you want to unlock the next tier of mission or what have you and tick it off the box, these are the mutators that you have to turn on. And that way, it kind of does. It nudges a curmudgeon like me out of his hole and gives a bit more of a go of the tweaking and the twizzling, albeit under sort of directive instruction. Though a lot of the perks aren't huge differences, they're little tiny advantages, but the game seems to want to give me like 50 of them or something, and honestly, the core of the loop is solid and stands alone on its own. It almost doesn't really matter a lot, at least in the earlier difficulties, what perks you're taking. Anyway, look, I don't need to waffle. It's very good. And look, we've had a couple of these, what I would call palate cleanser, these lighter, more casual games, these in-between games, and they've been very good quality. And this is yet another one that I would highly recommend you check out. Anyway, team, I might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.